Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We co-host this webinar with the History Standing Committee of the Statistical Society of Australia. And this is our fifth webinar of the Personal Journey series, where we hear from senior statisticians who have shaped our field. And today we're very honored to learn from Eric Sowey, but I won't introduce him. I'll leave to Nick in the end, so I won't spoil that. But I would like to start with acknowledgement of country. So in the spirit of reconciliation, the Statistical Society of Australia acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respects to the elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. And we encourage you to leave your camera on if you are comfortable, and it helps to create more connection and engaging space. So feel free, please, to turn on your camera so Eric may feel welcome and see your beautiful faces. And we also have Q&A in the end, but feel free to type your questions in the chat box, and I will go through them in the end in the Q&A. So it's wonderful to see all of you here. And I will pass the word to Nick Fisher from the History Standing Committee to properly introduce our great speaker of today. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniela. In fact, I'm going to say very little because Eric has supplied quite a bit of biographical information and the rest he will relate. I simply want to say it's a great pleasure to introduce my friend, a splendid scholar, teacher, somebody who's done a great deal for the local branch, including with David Griffith setting up the Jim Douglas Awards night. And I very much look forward to hearing what he has to say. So welcome, Eric. Thank you very much for agreeing to do this, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you. So I'll say thank you to Nick now for the introduction. Very nice of you. I'm also going to say thank you to Daniela for chairing, and also to Jody Phillips, who's doing technical operations behind the scenes. When Nick and Dennis Truen invited me to take part in the Personal Journey series, I was pleased, but not only for the compliment that represents, but also for how meaningful it is to me to be in your company, enthusiastic young people at a quite critical time in your lives. Now, I have been where you are now, and so it's not surprising that I have some suggestions to make. When you were thinking about where to go from here and how, those ideas might be practically useful. I hope you'll find them relevant. Everything I'm going to say in this talk is intended descriptively and not prescriptively. It's not for me to say what you ought to do. It's to say, this is what I did, and perhaps some of these matters will be responsive when you hear them. If you brought the handout with you, that'll be good, because then we can follow along the 4 facets of my life that I have set out on the handout, and I'll of course signal as I'm moving from one facet to the other. When I look back over my career, the thing that's given me the greatest pleasure is to have worked as a statistician. And here is a little anecdote that will dramatize the reason for that. There's a story about Herbert von Karajan, who was a worldwide recognized orchestral conductor, and for many years conducted the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra. He was famous everywhere. He came out of a concert hall in Vienna, Austria one day and stepped into a taxi. Of course, the taxi driver knew who he was, and I said to him, "Good afternoon, Mr. von Karajan. So where to, sir?" And he looked at the taxi driver and he said, "It doesn't matter. They want me everywhere." And that's, of course, for us statisticians, a similar situation. They want us everywhere. That means not just all over the globe, but they need us in all the disciplines, at least all the many disciplines for which there is a statistical place. And when you think about itemizing those disciplines, you can be amazed by the scale. Let me tell you, where statisticians are welcome in fields of human knowledge, in physical and biological and social sciences, in architecture and engineering, in medicine and law, in finance and marketing, in history and politics. In fact, it's hard to find a discipline in which statisticians do not have a place. Harder to find one of those than to list the ones where we know that they are welcome. I have been a statistician in a social science, in economics, and I've identified 4 facets, as I've just mentioned, in my life, partly connected with my career directly and partly indirectly, and they're the ones to which we're now going to turn. So I'll come to facet number 1, which is all about how I became an interdisciplinarian and how I enjoyed the journey. When I finished school in 1959, all the bright kids were being pushed into the physical sciences and mathematics. My interest at that time was in how mathematics could be useful in the sciences. I didn't know any statistics because there was no scope for statistics in the mathematics curriculum of that time. I asked some people to give me advice about what it would be good to do in university for my first degree. I got various pieces of advice, but a very insightful advisor said to me, well, look, Eric, what do you want to be? Do you want to be a large frog in a small pond? Or do you want to be a small frog in a large pond? I thought about that for a while and decided I'd like to be a large frog in a small pond. So then he said to me, well, there's no place for you in the physical sciences now where everyone is. That's packed with people. You should go into a social science. That was an interesting piece of advice. I wondered about which social sciences I could study. And I looked at the university offerings and I saw among the social sciences, there was courses available in economics, in psychology, in sociology, in education, and in anthropology. I reflected on these. Economics intrigued me the most, though I didn't know any economics either, because at high school, the way it worked is if you specialized in the physical sciences, the economics enrollment was cut off to you. If you did economics and geography, you couldn't do the physical sciences. So I started with no statistics and no economics, and I enrolled in an economics degree. You couldn't do a maths major in an economics degree. All you could do was a statistics major that was economic statistics, which was 1 year of mathematics and then 2 years of statistics. So I enrolled in that pattern. I was puzzled right through my first year when nobody in the economics department ever mentioned that the statistics that I was studying could be useful in that discipline. I thought that was a bit strange because it seemed to me reasonably obvious that a statistician and an economist have a place in life together. The same happened in the stats department. Nobody teaching me the rudiments of statistical inference ever mentioned that statistics could be useful in economics. So that went right through first year, and it went right through the first half of second year. I was getting more and more puzzled about this. Then suddenly they announced in the second half of second year, look, there's a change in the syllabus for macroeconomics too. There will be an introduction to econometrics. Now, that was the first time I'd ever heard of the word econometrics. I didn't yet know what was coming, but the academic department I was in had recently recruited a new lecturer finishing his PhD at Stanford, who was very keen to tell us all about econometrics. Now, at the level we were at, there was no sense in talking about advanced ideas in econometrics in quantitative terms or even in algebraic terms. What he did was to talk about the potential of econometrics for economics, and that was exactly what I was waiting for. He explained that with an econometric model, which was a regression model of greater or lesser or greater complexity, you could do 2 things that were very important for economists. First of all, you could forecast. That means in a scientific way, with the prediction interval with a standard error, not in the way of a clairvoyant, you understand? And once you had a good econometric model, you could use that to test out alternative settings for economic policy. You had policy variables like an interest rate. You were trying to discover how that might affect the level of private investment. And you could experiment with a good model on different levels of interest rate settings to see what might be the consequence for the level of private investment. At that stage, of course, all that could be demonstrated was with a single estimated regression equation. To portray an economy with its complexities, you would need at least 15 to 20 simultaneous equations to be realistic. But after that, of course, in the history of econometrics, we see models of 100 equations, 120, 150 equations, because that was the only way to be realistic. But of course, computing in that scale of model had not yet come our way. Computers in the early 1960s were still very primitive, and the courses in econometrics were theoretical rather than practical. That all changed in the later 1960s. So I was fired by this very much. I thought I will become an econometrician. It wasn't only the substance of econometrics, very practical substance, that appealed to me, but it was an interdisciplinary field. And that interested me in its own way. You see, in that era, there were very, very few interdisciplinary studies. You may laugh today because interdisciplinarity is the order of the day in so many fields, but it wasn't so at that time. And it was very exciting to think that I was going to bridge two disciplines, and that would be not only intellectually stimulating, but practically useful. So I learned some interesting things from the way I discovered econometrics, which became my career. The first was follow your curiosity. Go where your curiosity leads. Don't do things because people tell you it'll make you rich or it'll fill your time completely, whether it's interesting or not. Don't be bullied or pushed by others. Make your own decisions according to curiosity. And then after that, I learned that it's important to think for myself, because even if I might be stimulated by curiosity, I'm still available to be pushed around. Thinking for yourself, that means thinking independently, is a very powerful attribute to cultivate. Similarly, don't overplan your life, because serendipity is a large part of life. Finding happy solutions or happy outcomes for situations you're in, as it were by chance rather than by design, is well worth cultivating. Serendipity should never be crowded out. Now, let us look at what happened after I finished my economics degree. I'd learned a modicum of statistics. It seemed to me not nearly enough for what econometrics would require. So I decided to do a second degree, a Bachelor of Science degree, in which I would major in pure mathematics and mathematical statistics. That was very good advice that I gave myself, and it turned out to be extremely valuable when it came to the end of that degree, and it was time to think about education in econometrics for my third degree. That was, of course, going to have to be a postgraduate degree, because in that era, there were no undergraduate courses at all in econometrics anywhere. But postgraduate courses were emerging. None in Australia. In Britain, there were 5 universities, as I recall, where they had a taught master's degree in econometrics. In the United States, I think there were another 5 or so. Canada, maybe 1 or 2. But it was still not widely offered, this discipline. Many of my friends went to England, and I thought about it too, and I decided I will go to England as well. I didn't know where I'd be studying. There were 4 of the 5 universities to whom I applied. They were all around the country. I went to interviews in those 4. They all gave me a place in the graduate school, but only one, that's the London School of Economics, had a scholarship which would help defray my expenses. I won the scholarship there, and that was very welcome, because although I'd earned a little bit of money along the way, I was poor, and I had a lot of expenses when I was away from home, looking after myself. I enrolled in the London School of Economics taught Masters MSc in econometrics, and I found 9 people in the course, 8 others with me. The substance of the course was extremely high-powered. It was as if nobody cared particularly about the level of achievement in stats and in economics that we had reached in our previous education. They just launched into what they wanted us to know. That was stressful. And I used to think during that year that if it had only been 18 months, it would have been much, much easier to assimilate what I had to master. But it wasn't 18 months. So I just had to knuckle down and work with it. At the end of the MSc degree, it was time to return to Australia. And I had come back to a tutorship that was fortunately a little source of income for me. But I decided if I'm going to be an academic, and by then I decided I wanted to be, I would need to do a PhD sooner rather than later. So I embarked on the doctorate, and I want to mention a very important thing that I decided I wanted to do right at the very beginning. I wanted to have input into the choice of my doctoral work. I wanted to be in control of the fields where I'd be doing my work. Why do I think it's so important to have input into the choice of topic? Well, here's a little story. I went to New York once, and I went to a party friends had arranged for me. And there was a woman there who was nicely suntanned and smiling. And I said to her, why are you so happy? She said, I've just been on holidays and I've got all stress-free. I'm ready to face the world again. And I said, so where did you go? And she said, I went to Aruba. And I said, where's Aruba? And she said, how do I know? I flew there. And so I thought about that and thought, well, isn't that interesting? So it is with the PhD, that very often you are flown by your supervisor to the research frontier, where the supervisor has a special area that is so beloved by him or her and wants you to succeed in that area. That can be rewarding, but it has a trap. And the trap is that you might be marooned out there, stranded in the supervisor's research area. Because after all, if you think about it, the distance that you achieve, sorry, I beg your pardon, the distance that you travel in your formal courses is still quite a way away from the research frontier. That's true in many, many disciplines. And so, as I said, it's important to know your path. What is the path from the maximum distance that you've mastered in your coursework already, and that where you feel confident, up to the research area? Can you bridge that? If you can, then I think you're very secure in your PhD work. But if you can't, as I say, it can be a little discombobulating. And after all, in the end, it would also strand you in your supervisor's area of passion. Now, I wrote my thesis on applications of the Monte Carlo method in econometrics. I was able to be in charge of all the areas in which I did my thesis. In other words, the 3 applications that I did. And that, of course, meant that I was grateful for my supervisor's suggestions, but I was not stranded in his research area. And in fact, he had so many research areas, you couldn't talk about him ever being stranded, but there was a risk for me in other themes, in other areas. So at the end of the PhD, which was 5 years long because I had to do it part-time since I had a job, I was at last the qualified interdisciplinarian that I had dreamed of being at the beginning of all these studies. Now, I thought this is terrific because in another way, it's a great way to make professional friends. Wherever I went, to economists, to statisticians, I'd be a welcome arrival. Well, that was not to be, because when I went among the economists, they said, we hear you're a statistician. What is it that brings you here to us? And when I went to the statisticians, they said, we hear you're an economist. Why are you here? And I thought to myself, well, this is not as straightforward as I thought it would be. Among the econometricians, of course, I was very welcome, but the econometricians were very few in number. So building professional friendships, which I thought would be a pushover as an interdisciplinarian, turned out not to be the case. let me mention one other thing about having become an econometrician, and that was it was difficult to explain to a layperson what an econometrician does. And I had cultivated saying, I'm a statistician and an economist. Again, what do you do? I'm a statistician and an economist. So one day, I found myself in a cafe. It was in London. It was a very crowded cafe. And the waiter had asked a man sitting at the table by himself, would he mind if I sat with him? He didn't mind at all. He was well dressed and he was reading something very serious. And we fell into conversation. And after a while, he said to me, so what is it you do? And of course, true to form, I said, I am a statistician and an economist. His face went a bit blank and his eyes stared a little bit and he seemed to tune out. I spoke a bit more and then I noticed he was still like that. So I said to him, are you all right? Have I said something to offend you? He said, no. I was just wondering how you combine your professionalism as a statistician with your passion as a communist. From which I drew the conclusion that it's very important always to speak clearly. Let's now turn to research. Since the 1920s, I would say, the valuation of scholarship, by which I mean doing new research, synthesizing the research of others, and of course teaching, scholarship's valuations had a large number of fashions, both by the era and by the discipline. That's very important to know. It's not just the era, but also disciplines have fashions too. In my era, which was from the 1970s, and in my fields, economics, econometrics, my view of the purpose of research put me in conflict in two ways with the fashion that was then current. The first way, I think of research as building intellectual capital, and ultimately that's for the benefit of society. The fashion was that the purpose of research is publication. And the second factor, I think of research as an extended interplay of investigation and reflection. The fashion was to show that one is constantly publishing because, as I was once told, and I quote, you don't get paid for thinking. Some may find this to be a caricature of reality, but there is no doubt that since the arrival of bibliometrics, and in the world of global university rankings since about 2010, this has produced a permanent distortion of the place of research in an academic career. Let me just say now that these views, which I've just expressed, and my own broad intellectual interests have colored my choice of research areas. On the handout, I've put 4 of my papers, as an indication of the sort of thing I've done. I've only got time to talk about 2 of them today, so I'll take reference 2 first. Reference 2 grew out of my, my doctoral work and was concerned with stochastic simulation of an econometric model of the Australian economy. This was an area of very great interest in economic policymakers in the federal government and in the Reserve Bank of Australia. It was a very practical contribution to economic policy making at the time. And there you see again, the notion of practicality in what I was doing appealed to me very greatly. It was research with the practical objective that I was always trying to achieve, no matter which area I entered. And you may look at reference number 1 as another example of practical work. I'm not going to talk about it now, but it's another characteristically practical area which I found very interesting to work in. Reference number 3 is an example of my curiosity-driven research. And you know how much I've already emphasized curiosity in a scholarly career. I've been noticing that very few economists in business and in industry had been talking about econometrics, even though we were teaching our students at the university just how practically useful econometrics was in the job market. Now, that troubled me. The students made comments to me about this, especially the postgraduate students, and I decided I will do an investigation of the whole picture myself. I will do a large-scale appraisal of the value of econometrics to economists in business and government. And so I chose an area of the economy, which was the housing sector. And there I went out and did personal interviews with 50 senior economists, 50. After that appraisal, I was in no doubt of the general drift of opinion, and that was that econometrics in practice is not nearly so useful to those people as we had been saying inside the university. I published the paper in 2002, and that was very unwelcome news for my colleagues. There was already at that time a clear separation between the ideals we held for econometrics and the view taken in business, government, and in industry about the actual contributions of econometrics. That has led to a development which, watching now from a distance, I see is actually worsening. There is now evidence that a split is in the making. Talking about econometrics in idealistic terms is not going to cut it in the job market. It's not to say that you're going to damage your prospects, but it's certainly not necessarily enhancing the prospects. This may account for the fact that study of econometrics is declining in our universities these days, and it remains to be seen how the discipline will respond. There are other reasons, of course, why econometrics may have overstated its own merits. I haven't time to discuss them now, but you might like to take them up in the question time. Econometrics has limitations, and those limitations are now becoming more apparent. But I do want to mention that econometrics, which flourished in the 60s all the way up to the 90s, has begun, as I say, to become a declining discipline. Now then, I want to turn to the second of my facets, which is my work as an educator. In common with many of you, I'm sure that I was the one, like you, who chafed at the quality of teaching I had as an undergraduate. I didn't appreciate the lack of clarity and the lack of coherence which my teachers offered to me in the way of teaching. In fact, I was even more offended by the fact that very few of them cared very much whether they excited my curiosity or my enthusiasm in the subjects they were teaching. I found that quite an affront. I remember saying to myself many times that if I ever got to be a teacher at a university, I would not be doing this to my students. I had a lot to learn, of course, before I got right the way that I should be doing it. And the first thing that I got wrong was to think that I could have success with my teaching if I taught the way I would like to be taught. That's by no means a guarantee of anything when other people are concerned, because people have different learning styles. And in any class, you may expect a number of people to have a number of different learning styles. And if you do not teach so that at least you accommodate 2 or 3 learning styles at the same time, then you will disappoint the students with the diversity of learning styles, and they'll start to have an opinion of their teacher that I had of mine. That was something that it was very important to get under my belt. And in the course of my first 10 years of teaching, I did that because, of course, you couldn't live up to your ideals if you did not. But then something occurred to me that was far, far more important and has been far more influential in my thinking about teaching at tertiary level. And that is the need to teach for long-term retention of student learning. After all, why do we teach? We teach students so that they will have technical knowledge that they may use in their professional capacity. But think about how we teach statistics. Statistics is taught for most people who only do one course in statistics in their career, is taught in first year. And yet we want them to have those skills that we teach to be available to them in the first couple of years of their working life, at least, if not longer. How long then do we want students to retain their knowledge? Well, think about it, roughly 4 to 5 years. If they haven't, what was the point of teaching statistics in first year, if only a shadow remains of what it is that we so carefully taught? That was very clear then to me that I need to work out how to teach for student long-term retention of learning. And that was a field in which I started to think about by talking to my students. And that's one of the lovely things about being a teacher who cares, that your students are very responsive to that, and they're grateful to be considered worthy, if you like, to sound an opinion on an issue like that. I don't see it like that at all. I see it as life-saving for the teacher. But anyway, my students were very forthcoming, and I reflected a lot on what I learned from them. But then I went to the literature, as you might expect, higher education literature on learning. And you know what? It wasn't very helpful at all. And why not? Because if they want to do studies on retention of learning in the psychological literature and to do it formally with all the statistical tools that are implied, then you need to be able to take the cohort that you taught in first year and reconvene that cohort after a number of years so that you can measure the degradation of their learning. You can reconvene the cohort for a year, maybe for 2. Hard to do it after that. After 5 years, you can forget about it. And that's why the literature on retention of learning in psychology is a literature which says we tested them a year after we taught them. That's a joke, of course. It doesn't begin to meet the criterion which I've set up for my goal to teach so that students remember in the long term. So then what are the issues and what is the product of my reflection? First of all, it's a no-brainer to recognize that emotion plays a very large part in teaching. It's in part in imparting the knowledge and in absorbing the knowledge. People must be ready to express emotion. Most of all, the students are looking for emotional clues in the reason why they are learning the subject that we are teaching. If you want to contribute emotionally, you can't, of course, avoid what is the most important for transmission of knowledge, and that is the cognitive dimension. Of course not. Of course not. Cognition is primary, but emotion must not be ignored. If you think back to how you were taught, I would have a fair guess that for most of you, the teaching constantly represented facts and reasoning and arguments and so on that were cognitive. That means, excuse me, they were rational. What I'm now saying is we must supplement that by affective dimensions of teaching. That is, of course, as I was just saying, the emotional dimensions of teaching. So I went at it over the long term, trying to identify the really important emotional dimensions of teaching that will make a real difference to students' long-term retention of learning. Of course, I had to do some parallel thinking about the cognitive dimensions as well. Cognitive and affective need each other. That's, of course, very clear. The result of that was that I developed ideas that have really stood me in very good stead with my students, and my students in good stead with long-term retention. I should say all the papers I've written in this area are focused on statistics education, though of course the principles I talk about are applicable very broadly across fields of knowledge. In reference 4, you will find a summary, an overview of my papers in this area. And I can say to you also, again, from student feedback, that the students now recognize what it was that I was trying to do, and they indicated how much they had benefited from understanding my intention and how much it had helped them achieve what I was seeking, being involved emotionally with their subject and flourishing as a consequence. And it was exactly the same kind of motivation that stimulated me and my colleague Peter Pettot to write about our delight in statistics. We published a book in 2017. This is the book. I'll hold it up to the camera. Oops. Can I get it into focus? Don't know why I'm having trouble. Can you see? Is it all clear? I hope it's clear. It's a book called The Panorama of Statistics. And it is written with the sheer delight of statistics as the uppermost motivation. A Panorama of Statistics, Wiley 2017. Now, I think that you, my listeners today, you are our ideal readership, and I recommend it to you for the opportunity to see statistics on its affective dimension, not just its cognitive dimension. I want to mention two further facets of teaching that is very valuable to consider, whether or not, excuse me, whether or not you are an academic. The first is the importance of educating your statistical clients. Almost everybody who works in statistics in some way becomes a consultant statistician for one group or another. When people come to you for advice, very often it will be the advice that they are seeking because they have no idea what to do at all. That's a category on its own. But far more commonly, people say, well, I remember something vaguely about my statistics training and I've done this. And you look at it and you say, no, that just isn't going to work. Well, instead of saying, no, you can't do that, do what I'm telling you now, I think it's really constructive to say, yes, I see what you've tried to do, but it isn't going to be effective for the following reason. And here I want to explain how you can do it better. But you've taken the trouble to give an explanation of the deficiency of their approach. And that is enormously valuable to people, unless they're, of course, completely uncaring about the role of statistics in their work. But I don't think most people in the areas we frequent are like that. So if you have a chance to do some consulting, do your clients a favor, help them understand where they've gone wrong. And there are so many examples I could cite at this moment, and you will have many more. You don't even need a nudging, and they come to mind straight away. I mean, obviously, misusing the tools of descriptive statistics just for data display is such an obvious example. Secondly, understanding the correct meaning of statistically significant. If you're doing a frequency domain, sorry, if you're doing frequency, let's try again. If you're doing classical statistics, I'll put it like that. Also, ensuring randomness in surveys. That's another bugbear. People will say, I've just had, collected opinions. People have self-nominated their views. You say, well, you're not going to get far if you try to generalize from that. And you've got to explain to them the critical relevance of randomness in survey sampling. The second thing that will be relevant to most of us that are doing statistics at work that involves some kind of comment or criticism of others is to call out deliberate misinformation and falsification. Clearly, we hope there will not be many instances where that will be happening. But if we do come across instances of what we judge to be deliberate misinformation and falsification, then it's important to act. If you look away from that, it does two things. First of all, it damages public trust in statistics. And secondly, it damages your reputation for integrity. And bear in mind this, that integrity is like virginity. You can only lose it once. Let me now go to the third of my facets. That's improving things within my sphere of influence. Once you have a certain level of seniority, I recommend working to improve the things within your sphere of influence with which you are rationally discontent, where you can explain what it is, what's wrong, and what you think should be done. This is an ethical thing to do, and that in itself is a strong recommendation for doing it. And secondly, it's more constructive than complaining. But I have to warn you that if you do want to improve things within your sphere of influence, it's always an uphill task. It's often thankless, and it's very rarely long-lasting. I want to give you two examples in which I have tried to improve things within my sphere of influence, one which worked and one which flopped. Let me tell you the first one. When I was working at the academic board at the University of New South Wales, I wanted to get the university to properly value its indispensable educational role, and that was lapsing. That was lapsing all over the place. I wanted the university to see that its role as an educational institution was to prepare the next generation of professionals in the best possible way for our country. That's something that a lot of academics manage not to think about at all. Secondly, I wanted the university to recruit talented teachers, not just talented researchers. Advertisements for academic positions hardly give any more than nominal attention to the capacity of a teacher to stimulate and inspire his or her students. And thirdly, I wanted the university to recognize that it was just as important to reward esteemed teachers as it was to reward esteemed researchers. Well, that was a multi-strand project which I brought to the academic board. Of course, I was not alone in this. Lots of other people were relieved that somebody is actually pushing this into action. Of course, it was taken out of my hands at a certain point because other people with their own ideas, all constructive, were keen to rush forward and do something useful as well. But it was well coordinated and it was well thought through. And as a result, the attitudes at the University of New South Wales for about 15 years had substantial transformation. People commented on it as well. And of course, it had a lot of opponents from people who didn't see why any of those goals were worth upholding. But there was push through on this issue. And it was, as I said, about 15 years of good value. And then, of course, new fashions came in. I commented to you about the role of fashion in all aspects that are in academia. The new fashion came through and people managed to forget about the ideals that they'd espoused for such a long time before. That was an achievement, I would say, because as I commented, you can't expect any change you push through to be long-lasting. The world is not like that. Here's the example that flopped. Between 2008 and 2010, I was invited to come as a syllabus writer for the statistical component of what was a new national mathematics curriculum. And that was in Year 12 curriculum in Extension 2. In other words, in the top class in statistics for the brightest students, let us say, in the new national mathematics curriculum. And it was touted as a curriculum for the 21st century. I mean, you could hardly be more idealistic, could you, in setting out the goals? But now it came to the matter of achieving the goals. Well, since I was asked to write the curriculum for the top stats course in the final year, I thought, well, I'd better do my best with this. And I went forward and I wrote a syllabus involving a couple of different subjects in which I sought to achieve what I had always wished had been achieved by stats education courses to this day, but hasn't been achieved. And that was twofold. I wanted the course to mention explicitly the form of logic that underpins school mathematics from the earliest years, algebra, geometry, calculus. The logic, of course, that underpins them, as we all know, is deductive logic. You will not find the word deductive logic in any syllabus document that I saw in the New South Wales education system. I have never seen a teacher ever mention deductive logic, not that there aren't some who might, but I've never come across it. And I have asked my first year students year in, year out, do you know what deductive logic is? Silence. I say, put up your hand if you know what it is. A few hands go up, and then a class of 200, I will see no more than that. It's a ridiculous situation to be in, and I wanted to change that. Similarly, I wanted to make the contrast between deduction and induction by taking the statistical component to the level of statistical inference. In other words, that the statistics course at that level should encompass one or other of the statistical inferential results that we can achieve with statistics, with modern statistics. Because, as you know, the school syllabus in statistics has been relentlessly descriptive. Year in, year out, students hate it. It's boring as hell. Nothing advances over years and years of work. But we are always told, don't start with statistical inference at school. It's too complicated. So my aim then was twofold. One is to link, first of all, to introduce the notion of logic in thinking, and secondly, to distinguish deductive logic from inductive logic. Well, there were committees that oversaw the work of the syllabus committees. And even though I had first to defend my views to the other writers in the syllabus committee, and they were trenchant critics, I can tell you, I finally managed to convince them all how important this was. But this overriding committees of review stamped on everything I did and said, how on earth, we can't ever teach this? It's impossible. I said, well, why? And they said, because the teachers don't know how to teach this. I said, well, of course they don't, but we will make it possible for them to learn. After all, this is how everything advances. It's a course for the 21st century. The result was none of my achievements was actually carried forward. None of them, even though I succeeded halfway. As I said, you can expect that it will be thankless and that you might not succeed. Now, let me go on to the number 4, the last of my aspects. This is about my professional life not being all of my life. And it goes to the work-life balance. There's a very nice saying, you may know, there is no dress rehearsal for life, and this is the only performance. That, of course, is saying, get your work-life balance right. Now, because I believe that is profoundly important, certainly been important for my life, I have been practicing it as long back as I can imagine, as I can remember, forgive me. Volunteering is one very large source of getting you into the world that is away from your professional preoccupations. The other is having hobbies, also taking you to a different world. In volunteering, let me give you some examples of what I've done. It's not intended, as I said, in any way to be something for you to do, but I just want you to see that I found different directions which gave me new outlooks on life. The first was I spent about a decade with my local council library as an occasional advisor on building a large classical music library. That was first with cassettes, then with CDs and DVDs. The people on the staff there said, we don't know anything about classical music. And I said, I know lots. And so it was a fair exchange. You know, I substituted there knowing nothing with lots. And the result of that was library users who commented on how fabulous the collection is. It was a very rewarding change, but it took me into a completely different world with my colleagues at the library. Then I spent about 20 years on the board of one of the residential colleges at New South Wales University. There I met students in a completely different framework. It was collegial, it was informal, and I could talk to students about any number of things. Mostly I didn't talk, I listened, because they were all, as I said, juniors. They were in student residence, mostly undergraduates, and I had insights into student life and how life looks to people decades younger than me for free. They offered it with pleasure, and I enjoyed listening similarly with pleasure. I spent 15 years volunteering as a webmaster and archivist for the University Community Orchestra. The University Orchestra was all very informal and very, as I said, very communal. You didn't have to be a music student. You didn't need to be a good player. That was me, not being a good player. But I could certainly do webmastering, and I could certainly do archiving. I have years of practice in archiving. So that took me again into another dimension. All of these examples of volunteering, and there are others I could mention as well, as I said, took me out of my academic role and gave me a glimpse of the world very, very different from my academic work. The other is hobbies. Hobbies are also good to have. The more outre they are, the more they take you away from your daily work. Bushwalking was a passion of mine for so many years in the national parks of New South Wales and Victoria. Of course, getting out into nature is a very different world from academia, and it benefited me enormously. My languages are French and German, and I put a lot of effort into mastering these languages to the best of what ability I may have in languages. I can tell you, when you're in the backwoods of a country where French or German is the language, the people don't speak English, it's a whole lot better than sign language, getting on with them. And if you do a little bit more study, you can discuss daily affairs with people. When they can speak in their own language and not have to stumble along in their residue of English from school days, they are very grateful. And you can hear enormously informative things from people in another society that is irreplaceable in any other fashion that I know. And music, playing music is another great hobby. And that's something I've benefited from as well. When Daniela Vasquez gave me advice about how I should respond when I asked to give this talk, she said, excuse me, at the end, would you now say what you think about this? Would I choose now to live my life differently if that were possible? And I think you can see that the answer is no.
Thank you so much, Eric. Such an inspiring story to hear. And yeah, a lot of impactful work, not only in academic and your profession, but in the community as well. So it's really, really inspiring. Thank you so much. And if anyone has questions, please feel free to unmute yourself or to type in the chat, and I will read them out if you want to. Just reading the chat moment. There's a thank you from Pavel saying, like, what a fantastic presentation, Eric. Thank you for your wisdom and humor. If anyone wants to unmute, but otherwise I can ask a question as well. Let me just check. So Eric, what do you think is the biggest challenge or opportunity facing this new generation of statisticians? Oh, sorry, Dennis, I didn't see your hand up.
Would you like me to answer that?
Dennis can ask his question, and then I'll...
Okay.
Hi.
Hi, Dennis.
Hi, Eric. Thanks for a great talk. I hadn't actually realised we had a few things in common. I also did a master's in econometrics and statistics at the London School of Economics under Dennis Sargent, who probably was one of your teachers, and
Yes.
A very young David Hendry, who may not have been there.
He was my classmate.
Oh, was he? Right. Okay. I was also involved in the national income forecasting models for Treasury. In fact, it started at the ABS because around about 1970, Treasury wasn't quite sure that these sorts of tools were for them. So the national income forecasting work actually started in the ABS under guidance of Chris Higgins, who went on to become a Secretary of Treasury. But my question was that you mentioned you've had multidisciplinary interests all the way through. And I was wondering, were you ever tempted to pursue a non-academic career, at least for a period of time? Because it seems like your interests were always, looking outside, not looking at just looking at internal research.
The answer to that is probably I could have done it, but there was a lot of uncertainty at the time I came through. There was lots of work for everybody, but you didn't know where the work might be either rewarding emotionally and intellectually, and also where it would have continuity. I saw people doing different kinds of jobs, but I didn't detect what it was that gave them fulfillment in what they did. That was the big thing that was missing. You could talk to people about, is it interesting to be a patent attorney, which was another thing I considered. Is it interesting to be an actuary, which is another thing I considered. And I did a lot of looking into those careers, but I couldn't detect what it would be like to be a long-term practitioner in the field, except that I discovered that in most areas you spent a lot of time sitting down, and I didn't like the thought of a lifetime of sitting down, whereas I knew that if I was teaching, I'd be marching backwards and forwards on the dais in front of the students, and at the end of each lecture I'd need a small rest to get over the physical demands. That was one of the stimulating things. I saw that in an academic career you had times of intellectual, deep immersion, you had times of fun and intellectual games, and you had times talking to human beings. That's another very important dimension for me, that I should work with human beings, not just with back office materials, back office positions. So that's the short answer. I tried a few things, but nothing has matched, in retrospect, the pleasures I've had from academia.